Welcome to the Experimentation podcast. This is Darius Vasefi from Infinity Ventures and experimentator.com. And today I'm speaking with Ken Durand, who's located in Atlanta right now. Thank you so much for joining me, Ken.
No, you're welcome, Darius. I enjoy it. Thank you.
So, Ken, if you want to give me a little background on your lessons and experience in the innovation and experimentation space, I would appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all. So Darius, I've had a very, I guess people would call eclectic background of different roles and responsibilities, and in both companies and startups alike. I've been part of 4 different startups. I've experienced everything from bankruptcy to a successful exit, so I know the full gamut of how that can work out. I've also worked for several different large companies over the years, and have been in a lot of different roles. So I guess sometimes I tell people maybe it's just that I get bored easily because I bounced around and from everything from operations to human resources to finance and accounting and all sorts of different things in product management. And I got into the product world, I would say about 15 years ago, and moved out from there, and then eventually began to work with innovation. And innovation at the time really meant business development of new ideas. How do we develop new business for our new ideas and things that may go with that? And that really started around what was machine to machine at the time, but now we talk about Internet of Things, but that wasn't even a term when I started working with it. And some of the things that were going on in that particular space and ideas that we had and driving new business opportunities there. Then from that, I began to learn about this nice little process out of Stanford called Lean Startup, and read Eric's book and began to embrace a lot of the things going on there, along with design thinking and some of the other aspects of different things, and started up a couple of different labs. One within Ericsson, the telecommunications company, another one now within Dover manufacturing company, where we built out kind of corporate innovation labs to do experiments and to drive towards business possibilities with new ideas.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's that's a very unique experience to have to actually have been in a startup environment as well as a corporate world because they're completely different. So I'm
Very.
sure you're going to have a very interesting take on how things work and don't work. So we'll get into some of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
So
I
which
know a
is
lot of
okay.
things that don't work, that's for sure.
That's how you learn, right?
That's right.
So let's talk about experimentation. When we talk about experiments, of course, maybe the first thing is that scientific experiments and biological experiments, but really what I'm really interested in is business experiments. So a
Mm,
business in and of itself is an experiment, right? An experiment is something that you don't know the outcome of, and you
right,
are trying to prove one way or another if it's correct or not, or how to evolve it to that point.
right.
So that's why the business experimentation part is really what our focus is. And I want to hear from you, what do you think, what's the role of experimentation in innovation, and how critical is it for an organization?
I think it is the lifeblood of actually being able to innovate. I think it's the most important part, and at times the least utilized area. And I've seen that in my experience of in the corporate world, especially. There's a there's a way in which the corporate world is constantly butting heads. And I'll explain it this way: the goal of, if you go back to scientific experimentation and scientific method and things like that, the goals are always create a hypothesis and then go prove that it's wrong. Right? You're
Mhm.
focused on proving things that, in proving out that something is not true, in order to, and when you've eliminated all the possibilities of it not being true, then it actually has the possibility of being true. That's a complete anathema to the enterprise world. Uh, there is no one whose goals, at the beginning of the year when they get their performance plan and their annual operating plan, where they come in and says, well, your goals this year are to prove that we're wrong about things.
Right.
uh, and
Good
and
point.
that is that's a it's a enterprises just don't work that way. That's, no one thinks that way. And so introducing experimentation with the idea of saying, let's go prove we're wrong about this. And I'd say there's a process that I use. I've coined it evidence mapping, which is a way of saying, let's separate out the things we know to be true from the things we believe might be true. And then our
Okay.
experiments are conducted on the things that might be true in order to prove out whether they are or are not, with the goal of saying, let's prove they're not true. And if we can't, we've got a chance, right?
Right.
Working from that kind of standpoint and that idea. So a lot of that is kind of like, part and parcel to going back to my lean startup days and thinking about things that way in the let's do this experimentation. Let's go through the build, measure, learn loop. Let's go through and look at it from a scientific method point of view and try to use experimentation to help us justify our beliefs in the business ideas that we have.
Okay. So, a lot of the work that is done in companies is under the umbrella of projects, right? And
Mm.
project is the actual implementation of something. But if you look at, for example, an entire experiment, the first part of the experiment is the definition and identifying what the opportunity is, what the goals are, and what the expectations are upfront. Then when that's done, then we actually bring in a project team and we say, okay, we've looked at this, it looks good, here's a budget, and
Right.
go build it. Then people go in and build the project, and then they take it to launch. And then from that point, then it's the job of another group to actually monitor. And then depending on the structure, if it's a waterfall or legacy, or if it's
Sure.
agile and pizza teams and stuff, depending on that, you do the evolution
Yep.
and the improvements to learn. And the, so the differentiation between a project and an experiment is really interesting for me, because we are used to think about work as projects.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is we're trying to change that, so we think of work as experiments, not projects. And we want everybody, even the developers, to understand what their work is actually impacting, and why they're doing what they're doing.
Hmm. Okay.
So that's like one of the things. And I wanted to see, like, what are your thoughts as far as like how projects are handled in corporations, and your experience in like seeing the challenges of that.
Yeah. So 100% agree with you that the corporate environment, generally speaking, gears itself around projects. They hire people who are execution-based project managers. They put, certain types of governance around them, all the things that they build, and then they encapsulate it. And the goal of a project is to reduce execution risk, right? So
Right.
we're going to execute against a particular deliverable, and we want to lower the risk of executing incorrectly. All
Hmm.
right. Experimentation for me is more about reducing the risk of uncertainty. And that uncertainty should already be out of the game by the time the project starts. Right. So if you're going to do a real project and you're going to execute against something and put execution based resources against it, then the uncertainty already needs to have been driven out through the experimentation process. Now, what I think happens most of the time in most corporate environments is that they're not very good at this uncertainty experimentation, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So they do one of two things. They either don't do it and then plug in these uncertain efforts into projects and then spend millions of dollars bringing to market something that no one wants,
Right.
or they only work on projects where certainty is extraordinarily high.
Right.
Those are really the only two outcomes, right?
Right.
Because unless you get lucky, you might get lucky putting something in a project every now and then and having it come out well. But we know from startups that, hey, 90% plus of those things fail. So I don't know why corporate ideas would be any better.
Hmm.
You got to consider, if they're uncertain, if they're highly uncertain ideas, they're not going to get any better than 9 out of 10 being wrong. So, do you have in place kind of an experimental process for weeding out which ones are wrong? And the high majority of them are going to be. Now, again, that's a difficult thing for an enterprise to face.
Hmm.
This concept of saying, hey, 9 out of 10 things that we're going to be talking about today are not going to be true. They've never issued a business plan at any point in the corporate life that showed it as being wrong.
Right,
They
right,
all look like the exact same hockey stick, right?
right, right,
So I would say that that's kind of the definition for me then about experimentation is let's do experimentation in order to decrease the amount of uncertainty of the business idea in order for us to understand whether or not a customer would have anything to do with that idea should we run a project. And
right,
we don't run projects until we know that,
right, right,
or at least have an acceptable level of risk on that.
right, right. And I mean that really brings out the other, question for people is the amount of risk aversion that people
Mm,
have. And when you talked about the culture previously, and the culture is really how risk averse is the culture of the organization to fail,
right.
or to really, there are no failures if you learn something from something, right?
Absolutely. Right.
You fail if you didn't learn something from it.
Yeah,
That's the
that's right.
real failure. That's a real failure. So unfortunately, we tend to like sometimes measure failure by numbers, and that's not the best way to. Sometimes yes, but not all the time. So that's like what the other part of it is that now you've had a lot of experience in, enterprise as well as startups as well. What do you think is the key differentiation of how these two types of organizations actually handle experimentation, or even are open to it?
Um, so I think something that you said is very true, and that is the risk aversion piece of this is a big part. In the enterprise space, especially if it's a public company, um, they don't get paid to take on much risk. It's just not something they're very good at. So there's a natural kind of tendency to be risk averse. And I think that's something, if you're going to do an enterprise innovation, you need to establish that parameter up front. Um, at a previous location where I worked, we used to call it, let's establish what the smallest viable market is. What is the smallest outcome that's acceptable? Is it a $50 million line of business? Is it a $100 million line of business? Is it a certain amount of customer adoption? Is it adoption in 50% of our top 50 customers? Is it, what is it what is a successful outcome? What's the minimum successful outcome that you're willing to accept? And that will help you define how much risk you're willing to take in order to do that and understand that kind of upfront. And innovators inside the corporate environment need to know that.
Right,
They need to have an idea of this going in, because they're going to have a set of ideas and they're going to have a portfolio of things to manage. And if they don't have any idea what the parameters are of success, and success, and it can't be made up success metrics, right? Oh, what, you have to have an ROI of blank. Well, we don't, that the outcome of the ROI of this idea is unknowable.
right,
That we can't predict that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say everything we're working on has that. Well, then nothing's ever going to fail, right? That
right,
doesn't make sense. So you can't be these vanity metrics. It's got to be something that really is based in learning. So I think that the risk aversion piece is a big piece of that. The second thing I think is a major difference between your average startup and the enterprise space is the way in which the leadership sees the direction. Um, and I've said this many times and done presentations on this before. There is something about entrepreneurs that's different. They have a different sort of personality, a different sort of the way they see things. For anybody who wants to do a little research, dig into the work by Dr. Sarah Sarasvathy at the University of Virginia, the Darden School of Business, on what makes entrepreneurs entrepreneurial. Great white paper, easy read that she's done on that. Somebody should go look at. People should go look at. But
yeah, I'll add that in the notes.
yeah, that's definitely worth thinking about in terms of the thinking style that people have who are entrepreneurial. And those people naturally migrate into startups because of the freedom and the ability to constantly change. Uh, there probably are some psychologists out there who would say, well, that just means that these people are kind of ADD. Their attention isn't heavily focused, and that may very well be true. Maybe that's the
It's true
reason
in
they
my
kind of
case.
wander into that. Yeah, it is for me too. I mean, and that's, they get bored pretty easily with certain things, and they want to move on to something else. They want to look at something else or think a different
They
way.
want to be
Uh,
creative. They want to use their creativity. Right.
yeah, they absolutely want to use the creativity, and they also don't ever really see failure. They can go up, down, sideways, backwards, forwards, and they're okay with that as long as they can continue to believe that the future is there, right?
That's
Uh,
it.
and
That's very important.
so it's their response to things is very different, and I think because of that, you run into a situation where in the enterprise space, because people really aren't in their normal execution based way of thinking, they don't really think that way. It becomes hard for them to look at like true innovation with high uncertainty outcomes. Now, there are ways in which you get to that, right? There are processes you can put in place. There are people that you can find. You have the right coaches, the right mentors, the right sorts of things. You know, there are companies and what that are doing good work in that area that should be looked at, and there are certain processes that can certainly be helpful there. But there is that core kind of people issue in one side and the risk aversion in the other that makes it kind of difficult to deliver against that.
Yeah, that is so true. So and I think startups by definition um, are starting from a point of total risk. So I think that really sets in the background and the foundation for people to not have that expectation of security or certainty upfront.
That's right.
So they start with that point of view, and then yeah. So
Yeah. I mean, if you take the time to read a little bit of that work I was talking about, you'll see that, it's probably we're probably born in kind of a 50-50 world, right? Where half the people kind of had this the entrepreneurial kind of view, and the other half have more of an execution point of view. It's called causal and effectual thinking. And you get into this, but the school system kind of takes a lot of that away. There's a really interesting study that I'll throw out there for you, that you can find that someone did, and they go in and they meet with kindergartners, and they ask for, I need someone to come up and draw something for me on the board. And everybody's hand goes up. They all want to come and do it. And by the time they get to middle school, when they do the same experience, no one will is volunteers to come and draw on the board, right?
wow,
They don't want to do that anymore. Or they may have, well, Robbie over there in the corner, we've seen him drawing on his notebook. He can do it, right? It becomes kind of this self-limiting thing that the
wow,
school system and the way we do education kind of limits to some degree, because you're focused on a particular outcome. You're learning because you've got to regurgitate it on the test. You've got to be able to deliver the paper. You've got to be able to do the book report. And it has to be 3 pages, and it has to be single spaced, and it has to be this, and it has to be that. And there's all of these rules, and the creative boundaries get pushed away from a lot of these people. So there are probably far more people with an entrepreneurial mindset, but it's been beaten out of them over time.
yeah,
And they don't really have that anymore. And that's the kind of people you're looking for in the enterprise, right? That are
right,
still in the enterprise
right,
for a reason. Maybe it's because they need a consistent paycheck or the healthcare benefits or whatever it is they need.
right.
But they've still got this kind of creative bent. And if you can find and target those people and pull them into the right types of roles, you can leverage that innate ability they have to be entrepreneurial. But you have to intentionally look for it.
So that's probably one of the challenges that you really need to master if you're setting up a corporate innovation unit or process. Is
Yeah, you really
finding
need to think about that. Well, it depends a bit on the types of projects you're going to do. If you're going to do corporate innovation, first you have to define what innovation means. Right? It can mean
right,
everything from, we're going to improve a particular process on the manufacturing floor, all the way to, oh, we're going to introduce an idea that's never been heard of before, that's completely new to the world, right? Highly, from certainty to, things that we can pretty well predict the outcomes, all the way to things where we can't predict anything about the outcome, right?
right.
And decide what of that is innovation and who's going to work on it, and how you're going to do it. But I do tell people all the time from the corporate innovation world is that if your goal is to work on projects with uncertain outcomes and have high probability of failure, you can't put your execution based resources against that. You've got to find people in the organization who have a different way of thinking about it. Doesn't mean there's no execution people on the team. It just means that you have to be able to put people against it who have that ability to see. I'll use a term that I stole from a professor down here in Georgia Tech. You have to put people in place who have the ability to notice what other people aren't noticing.
Right, right.
And it's a
Yeah,
different mindset that has
yeah.
the ability to do that. It's not just everybody.
And the courage
And
to say it.
yeah, and the fearlessness.
Yeah,
They don't to not care what people think. That's right.
yeah. That's what they call backbone, having backbone at Amazon. It's one of their principles.
Mm, that's a good one. That's a good
So
one.
yeah, so this is very, I mean, this whole process is so interesting. I think it requires a separate conversation in and of itself. So maybe we'll come
And
back to that.
lots of places we could go with that. That's for sure.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on is the design of experiments. So what's the right way to design an experiment? I mean, of course, you have to know what you mean even by an experiment. But if an experiment, for example, is to start a new product line
Hmm.
in an existing organization, let's say, for example, Dover or any other organization that, so somebody comes up with an idea. I mean, so that's the other part of experimentation and innovation is the value of ideas, of course. You want
Right.
as many ideas as possible from your team, and how to manage that, that's another process. But somebody comes up with an idea and it sounds good and it goes through and it gets to a point where you are actually looking at turning this into an experiment. What's the best way to design the experiment so that it actually leads to, I don't want to say successful, because that sometimes it could say, like positive ROI again. I don't want to say that, but how do you design the experiment so that it sets the right, expectations, and then all the way through to learn and measure and learn.
Right. So I think there's two things that are really important in that. Number one is that you have to go into the process of the experiment by knowing what your assumptions are. What are you assuming to be true that there is no evidence in place for yet? So what evidence do you need in order to assume that something is true and prove that out?
So would that be
So,
like the success factors or the metrics that you're going to measure against,
well, that's
or?
kind of the second piece is evaluating that. So I think there's two pieces. One is, and this is really difficult, especially in the enterprise. Enterprises are made up of experts at something. All right.
Mhm.
At Dover being a manufacturing company, we're expert at delivering manufacturing and building things, right? So, and we have certain, products that we build and we deliver to market. We do extremely successfully, and make a lot of money on them, and things are looking very good, and the stock price is great, and that leaves everybody with this feeling of we are experts at certain things, all right? But what happens is when you start doing innovation, you start wandering into things that are more uncertain, your expertise becomes a problem. It creates a cognitive bias, where it creates a series of cognitive biases, but
Right,
one of which is well known as confirmation bias. It says we are always looking for the answers that prove the way we already think, right?
right,
So step one then of the designing an experiment process is understanding what you already believe to be true because of your expert status, and then setting out to prove that it's not true.
right,
if if you set out to prove that it is true, the expert confirmation bias will take over.
right, right.
There's no need, because you will always come back with the same answer you thought you would have when you went in,
Or
right?
you'll
So
probably be constantly fighting against that.
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Or you'll be rationalizing away what you've heard.
right,
Uh, and so I kind of going back then. So step number one is we have to understand what it is that we're trying to determine whether it's true or false, because it's an assumption. We set out to prove that it's false, and then if we can't prove that it's false, then it may be true. All right, so we're going to work on that side. So understanding what your assumptions are is very, very important. And then the second piece of it is something that you then alluded to, which is what are your metrics to show that you have learned what you needed to learn?
Okay.
Okay. All right. So, and those are very individualized. Now, I teach from a mentoring perspective of teams. I teach them that the metric should be tied directly to the assumption itself. They're not broad metrics, they're specific,
Right.
and they last only as long as that assumption lasts. Okay. And then you need to set more. Now, this becomes a really difficult thing because people don't like to continually reset metrics, but I think we get off very so for instance, let me use this one. I had a friend of mine one time that told me, I asked him about what kind of success metrics are you using in your innovation program, and he started talking about, well, one of our success metrics is the number of experiments that we run. I'm like, well, it's not the number of experiments that you're running in my mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what that leads to is people wanting to cycle time experiences as much as possible in order to hit a number goal
Right.
as opposed to a learning goal, right?
Right.
So the metrics themselves then in part two have to be tied to what you're trying to learn. All right. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
I had a team I was working with one time that had this great idea for, and I won't go into it, but they had a great idea for cruise lines. And they were gonna pitch this to the cruise lines because this was going to make the passengers really, really happy. And believe it or not, I think it actually had some merit at the time. It was really kind of interesting. All right. So I'm like, okay, well, you've worked up your value proposition, your solution statement. You know kind of what it is that you think. You've got some assumptions about what you think the passengers would think and whatnot. Okay. So, and we came to the point says, okay, well, their next step was to find out, some of whether their value proposition resonated with the cruise lines. Right. So what type of metric do you put in place to find that out? Well, they were thinking about, oh, okay, we'll do a survey, we'll do this, we'll do that, blah 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 blah. I'm like, no, 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 no. Wait a minute. You're getting way too far ahead of yourself. The first validation of the metric of your idea is, will they even give you a meeting? If you
Mm-hmm.
can't pitch them something that will enable you to give them a meeting, whether it's either a phone call or a face-to-face. So you've got 5 target cruise lines that do the Mediterranean that you really would like to talk to. If you can't get one of those to give you a meeting, either face-to-face or on the phone, within the next 14 days, 2 weeks, your
Right.
idea is dead. Or you've got to pivot your value proposition because it's not meaningful enough for them to care, right?
That's very important. If I may cut in, it brings the differentiation between product experimentation and business experimentation. You're thinking about this is a business experiment. They're thinking about it's a product experiment.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And there is no reason to do a product experiment until you prove the business experiment is viable.
Right.
Why
That's the
go
whole
build something?
experiment, really. That is the real experiment.
Exactly. That's
Right.
right. That's
Right.
right. That's right. Is there any, if you can't prove to me that there's a customer waiting to buy it on the other side of this,
Right.
now it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do. Now again, obviously, I'll just put the disclaimer in here. There are things that we would do for the good of the world, right?
Right.
And because of the right thing to do, and all that. I'm not discounting that those things need to be done. But in the average enterprise that needs to be turning a profit, because from quarter to quarter, you're going to look for things that customers would actually pay for. And if
Yeah.
you can't find that, then that's the real experiment you're trying to run. Everything else is secondary to that
Right. And I mean, you bring a really good point. S- I actually think that we spend a lot more energy on vastly impactful projects, which are not really in the corporate world, in the public sector. Like you
one.
said, things for the good of the people. And those are usually the least successful projects for
Yeah,
some reason.
yeah.
So this
Well, but
idea
it's
actually applies to those as well. But again, we want to walk before we run. So,
well, and that's the reason I think that's the case. And I'm perfectly willing any day of the week to be wrong. Okay, but I think one of the reasons that's the case is because we frame public projects around concepts that no one will say no to
right.
intentionally,
You
right?
can't say no to, peace.
yeah, exactly, right? Or you know, well, we really need to do a project that ends slavery, you know,
Right.
human trafficking. That's what I was trying to think. I'm sorry. We need to do a project that ends human trafficking. Well,
Yeah.
who's going to say no to that? Well, I think
Right.
human trafficking is a good thing.
Yeah.
All right, let's take plastic out of the ocean. No, 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 no. We need more plastic in the ocean. Right. I mean, so you frame these public works projects in such a way, not about whether or not the particular idea is viable, it's whether or not human society could or could not be against it. You know, I used to have a friend of mine that said, you know, his pitch was always, well, don't you want to be thinner and in better shape and more attractive to your potential partners? Well, who would say no to that, right?
Right.
I mean, and that's
Start
it's
with
all
yes,
vanity.
right?
Yeah, it's all vanity. So that's kind of one of
Okay.
the key components of experimentation in my world is that no is a more reliable answer than yes.
Right.
Let
Yeah.
that
I
sink
mean,
in for a second. When somebody tells you yes, they may or may not mean it. Right. I get living proof of this with my wife every time I would say something about going out to eat. Right. I'd say, hey, I want to go to the Mexican restaurant. And when she says yes, it doesn't mean she wants to go to the Mexican restaurant. It just means she wants to leave open the option of going out to eat. And
right.
she'll tell me where we're going later. Right. Right. Whereas if I say, you know, do you want to go to the Mexican? And she says no, I know what that means. We ain't
Right.
going to the Mexican restaurant. Right.
Right. Right.
So that's kind of this concept of you have to get over in the experimentation world is that people want to hear yes, but they need to hear no. No is is the more valuable answer.
Hmm.
So you need to set up your experiment in order to drive towards as many no's as you can get, because those are the points. Um, I give a lot of credit to professor down here at Georgia Tech named Merrick First, runs a Flashpoint Accelerator down here. Brilliant man. And I've heard him say on more than one occasion, and I love this line. He says, the goal of any experiment is to figure out what you don't have to do so that you never do it.
That's
Right?
it.
Because
Yeah.
if you're doing things you don't have to do, you're spending time and resources
Right.
on something that no one will pay for,
Right.
or they won't pay any extra additional value for. Um, so why do we do it? Well, you know, it's feature creep. I'll give you another statistic. I will not for the sake of those who might be found guilty of this. I will not name the company. I will say it's not Dover, my current employer. Um, but there was a study done one time of all of the orderable items in the price book for a particular product line in a company. And what we found was, when we did that particular study, 67%, the full two-thirds of all of the items in in the price book had never been ordered in their history, not even once.
Wow.
Right? That's what's called product feature creep.
Right.
Right? Is
Right.
when product managers doing projects, right? Instead of customer-based experiments, they're doing delivery product projects. They put in all sorts of things that they think the customer might want or use, or some salesperson has told them, yeah, they'll buy this if you have X, Y, and Z in there. And they put it all in there without any evidence that anybody would ever buy it. And then you've got this huge conglomeration of things in your price book that no one ever orders.
Yeah. That's. I mean, that's classic. It's like in today's world with all the data that we have. It's just like it sounds like weird that that's the case, but it does happen. It's still so so going back to the design of the experiment, what do you think about the role of the hypothesis in actually setting up the experiment correctly?
Um, uh, you know, that's an interesting question. That depends a lot on the team that you're working with and kind of what they're doing. My experience has been that the role of the hypothesis is extremely important in areas where you're working with a lot of engineering and technical type of people, especially on application development or software or things like that, because they kind of instinctively get it,
Hmm.
and how all of that plays out. It's been a little less important, I would say, in some other areas, because they don't think that way. It's not a statement to be proven or disproven. It becomes a little more of I know this is going to sound a little bit weird, but in some situations, I think it's more important to talk to customers than it is to talk to them about something in particular. Does that sound crazy? Do you understand what I mean by
No,
that?
no, yeah,
I mean, I mean, I had this guy that I was working with at one time that we were we were working on the hypothesis that we had. We had a team that I've done both this type of work as a mentor and as a practitioner, and I believe that no one should be a coach that's not a practitioner. By the way, that's just personal belief. I think that you have to continually do this in order to be good at it.
right.
Um, but I had a team that I was leading, and I had a coach that would come in and talk to us every now and then, and we were in a conference room one day. We were working through the hypothesis, and all of a sudden he said, "Let's get out of the building. Let's just go find customers and start asking them questions." I'm like, well, we don't really know what we need to ask them yet. Doesn't matter. The most important thing you guys need to do right now is just get out there and talk to customers and find out what they're thinking. Give them the topic and see what they respond with.
Yeah,
And that was one of the most valuable things that we ever did in that team. Ended up being a real breakthrough for us, because what he realized that at the time I didn't realize was that the majority of the team was scared to death to go talk to a customer. They were trying to perfect the hypothesis and
right.
perfect the idea first.
Mhm.
And that's just not the way it ought to work,
They're
right?
trying to prove the experiment before it started.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. They're almost trying to make the point of going and talking to the customer irrelevant, right? So, oh,
Yeah,
well, we already know. Well,
yeah.
no, still don't know yet. So,
So that's another really important topic is education, right? So I mean, we go to school, we learn all these really fancy, interesting, useful things, but nobody talks about experimentation or innovation and things like that. And of course, then what do you expect, that when you go to work suddenly this is something that you need to learn? So that's the reality right now. Um, but the question is, how do we educate people in smaller organizations or in larger organizations or even teams within a larger organization, so at least we understand what we're all talking about?
right.
So, and then how open are people to even the idea of getting educated or spending money on, education for these things?
Okay, I'm probably gonna go off of some people's reservation here now. They're that aren't gonna, this may be mark the time code, because this may be editable
No,
here.
okay,
Um, I believe in this work that education is by doing. Um, I think that we've wasted too much time in the corporate spectrum of trying to get everyone on board with I did a presentation one time to a group of people at a conference that I called "The Three Ways to Kill Your Innovation Program," or "Killing Your Innovation Program in Three Simple Steps." And there were a couple of things, and one of the steps was declaring everyone's an innovator, because as soon as you do that, you devalue the people who really have that skill, right?
right,
The other thing you can do is that you declare that everything is an innovation, right? So you put the same weight on somebody who says, well, the temperature of the coffee is just too not hot enough. That idea gets some sort of meaning in the idea, in the suggestion box, the same as if something was actually a new business idea. So there's all these different sorts of things, and we try to, and I think that what you really want people to do is you want two things. You want and then I'm going to talk about this kind of in the enterprise level. And I think in startups is kind of it happens because you don't have the time or money or resources to focus on more than one thing at a time. In an enterprise, you got all these different areas where there are distractions because there's so many different areas. So the point I wanted to make was this: is that there is an importance to getting your population of leaders, and how you define leaders and at how many levels of the organization is every organization kind of independent on that.
right,
But they need to understand your purpose as a company, and the challenges you face going forward. What are the types of problems you anticipate in the coming years, and so that they begin to know what to look for. right? You
Right.
don't want a sales guy who's going to go call on one of your most important customers. You don't want the first time they've ever heard about augmented reality or artificial intelligence to be when the customer puts it in an RFP that they have to respond to,
Right.
right? So if your company is facing a challenge, you think going forward on robotics and automation, you need to be talking about that in some way, shape, or form, and educating people about the long-term problems that you face early, so that when they talk to customers or when they see things in the marketplace, they recognize them as the possible solutions to things that are they're facing in the long term, right? So that I think that's kind of the role of education in the innovation space, is to teach people about the problems that we want to look to solve. Okay. On the other side of that coin, I think it's that people learn by doing, and that you need to not try to give everybody a process, but try to build people.
Right.
Keep
Okay.
the process as simple as you can,
Right.
but build people who can interact with the process and who have the ability to pivot or move or change or see things as they change without instituting a tremendous amount of bias. And what you should do is build better people, not build better experiments themselves, right? If you build
Right.
better people, they will do a better job of the
Well,
experimentation.
people have to design the experiments. So if they don't know how to do it, if they don't even agree with it, if they don't appreciate the value of it, they're just not going to do a good job. So, and then, giving people the right tools to actually make it easy to do.
Right.
We know people that do experiments all the time. I mean, everybody does experiments, even if they call it so or not. But these experiments are all over the place in Google Documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Slack, email, chat. It's all over the place, and nobody knows what's going on. And then all of that information is lost
That's right.
after a project is completed. And so
Yeah.
we just
It's
keep
and
doing the same thing over and over and
the other
over
thing
again.
I'll add to that, that's exactly right. And the other thing I'll add to that, Darius, is that you may have a team of, let's say, 5 people over here working on something that learned something really important that this team of 4 people on the other side of the country needed to know about.
Right,
That could have really advanced their understanding of how to deal with the customer, and if they had learned it from someone else. And so connecting those dots with those teams is vitally important, in order to speed things up.
could have
Uh,
saved them a month.
yeah, absolutely,
uh,
absolutely.
just add these months up, and they just keep adding up.
That's right. That's
Right,
right. And then again, sometimes it's a technical thing that something learns, or sometimes it's a customer, doesn't want to do business a certain way. So why would you go in and recommend that again?
right,
Or maybe it's there's not a consumer need, or maybe somebody else is doing. Maybe they discovered, hey, wait a minute, there's this company up in Chicago that already has a patent on this, and oh well, nobody knew. Well, how did they share that? So I think that there is a certain place for tools and education and cross pollination that really exist, and is a huge need
right.
in any organization. How they communicate,
Okay,
and what they learn. How do you communicate the learnings? That's probably the most important part of the experiment process itself. Is how do you account for what you've learned uh, in a real way, truthful way, without bias,
right.
and then share that learning.
And how do you communicate even? How do you even, like, you can look at an experiment, you can look at the metrics. So the metrics are easier to quantify. Traffic went up, it went down, it didn't change. Okay. But the intangible lessons, somebody needs to go through and actually write that down in a way that is useful for other people, not only when they communicate, but also to be used in search. So what
Mhm.
we're talking about across the enterprise, this is called search, right? So
Right.
search is a major part of our work right now. And it's a very powerful tool if you can search quickly the data that's available in an enterprise. That is like a
Right.
killer advantage. So So those are all like the really interesting intricacies of getting this work done. And I think that's why there's so much potential to get better.
There
That's what
is.
excites me. So
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a huge potential to do that. I'll give you another example just from my own experience of, running multiple cohorts in different locations. And when you're running a cohort of, let's say, 3 to 4 different teams that are working together, and they're not working together, they're working on independent ideas, but they're working either co-located or at least they're communicating with each other in some form or fashion. Having that weekly readout is critical, where they hold each other accountable and where they talk about what they've learned, and each each of the groups gets the benefit of the learning from the other group. Now, finding ways to do that with an individual cohort is not that difficult. If you're running multiple cohorts that are different parts of the world,
right,
it becomes really difficult. And I've learned that firsthand. Is that when you have different teams in different parts of the world that are both learning on completely different time schedules, how do you coordinate in such a way as that learning doesn't get completely lost? And there's some advantage to that. Um, and some of the tools that we have today, whether it's, Slack or Teams or Skype or whatever, makes it somewhat better. But you're right on the how do you search that out and how do you catalog it and document it in a reasonable way.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, the future is going to be very interesting. A combination of software. So, I mean, that's like another topic again, is that software needs to make our life easier and simpler. And so far, every tool we add actually makes it more complicated. It's another thing to
Mm,
track. So that's a challenge we have to find a solution for. Nobody
yeah,
has a solution for it yet. We're still, we're experimenting, right? to
yeah,
get to that point.
that's
And then
right.
different forms of communication. Like I think voice is very powerful in certain cases to actually share the experiment lessons. People
Mm,
are, at different times, from the time that a person wakes up in the morning until they go to, sleep at night, our preference and propensity to take in information from different modes changes. It's not the
mm,
same. Sometimes we need to read, sometimes we need to listen, hear, speak, see. So that's going to be really the future. I think is going to be a tools that actually bring all of these things together, so that
right.
when Ken needs to hear or learn about something, it'll be delivered to him in the form that he needs it at that moment.
At that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the wonderful part of being in this industry for me.
Yeah. Yeah. That whole concept of just-in-time learning has been
Yeah,
talked about for a long time, but I think we're getting closer to having the tools to actually make that more of a reality.
yeah, yeah. Something else about a comment you meant about going off the reservation. That's a
Okay.
personal peeve. That's awesome. I love people who go off the reservation, because if you stay in the reservation too much, then that's where you basically don't grow and you don't learn things. So
Right.
for some reason, that has gotten a negative connotation. Like, he's going off the reservation. That's
Hmm.
awesome. Let's all go
Yep.
off the reservation.
That's right. And then I think that's and I look at that way a lot of times is that is, when I talk about that, the visualization that comes to mind for me is a gathering I went to one time with reserved seats, right? Where you had a row that had a big thing on these seats are reserved, right? And what happens when you get out of your reserved seat and go somewhere else and learn from something else? Yeah, I, I'm this type of person, which is either to my benefit or detriment some days, of I don't like boundaries. I don't like arbitrary boxes of boundaries, right? When I talk about the reservation, I like to get outside of my reserved area, of my sandbox, and see what's happening somewhere else, right? You want to do an experiment. One of the more interesting experiments that I did for a while, very, very simple. Get on an elevator with a group of people and face towards the back of the elevator instead of towards the door and talk to people. All right.
Yeah,
It'll completely change your day when you try to do that. And look at how uncomfortable
Right.
It makes everyone in the elevator when you're not facing the door,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that's the type of discomfort that we try to that I've been a fan of in the experimentation process. And it's difficult to find people who are okay with the discomfort
Hmm.
of looking at things from a different point of view and seeing things from a more diverse and a more inclusive and different way than the average status quo. Largest cognitive bias we have as humans is status quo bias. You know,
Yeah.
we talk about, whether it's the biological world and talking about homeostasis, or it's the songs that we write, like things like, hey, don't rock
Right.
the boat, baby, right? It's,
Yeah.
we don't want to change. I love you just the way you are.
Yeah.
We write, we immortalize status quo.
And we grow
And
up with these messages
that's right.
repeatedly, programmed into our minds.
That's right.
So,
So getting outside of your reserved area, outside of your sandbox, doing something a little bit different, that's the goal the experiment should have.
right.
In finding the truth. Where's
Right.
the evidence of the real truth?
Right. So, we talked about the lessons and how the lessons are actually coming out. What are some of the things that you've actually practiced yourself in getting, for example, lessons from experiments into the bigger ecosystem?
So it's an interesting question, because as you talked about, so there used to be, 20 years ago, it was, much like, I sometimes I tell people, innovation is like water in a lot of ways, right? It's this thing that everybody needs to do to survive. And 20 years ago, if I asked you, do you want some water? There was only one answer to that question, right? There was only one thing. Now, when I talk to you about water, it's like, do you want LaCroix, or do you want this flavored water? Do you want bubbles or no bubbles? Do you want, right? And that's the way innovation is. 20 years ago, when you talked about innovation, I think people kind of knew what it was. And now when they talk about it, there's all of these different flavors, and it's not this natural sustaining force anymore. It's confusing.
Hmm.
Okay. So one of the things that I've told people before is that I don't ever want to do another corporate innovation lab or project, or anything of that nature, factory, whatever you want to call it, without having a communications person, because
Okay.
communications now is so different than it used to be. Right. So 20 years ago or more, or in that realm, let's just say pre-major digital changes, when you wanted to communicate something inside the enterprise, there was really only two ways to do it, right? Somebody stood up in front of a team and told them, or you had a corporate newsletter. That
Right.
was really about it.
Right.
That was the only way you could communicate what you were learning and what you were doing. That was about it. And the annual shareholder letter. Um, Today, there are so many different ways in which to communicate, whether it be video, the way we're looking at each other right now, whether it be podcast, whether it be a magazine, or is it written form? Is it something that's on social media? Is it all of these different ways in which you can do that? So I think one of the biggest failures of the corporate innovation program is to not have a full-time communications person that is responsible for all of these different mediums and the voicing and the way that you present across all of them. And you need to be able to talk about the learnings across a lot of different spectrums of communication and try to hit people where they are. There can't be one single way in which you do that. You have to blitz it, because you
Right.
can't count on people looking at the one way you think's the best.
Right. So in other words, setting up a corporate innovation center or unit or whatever the word is really the first experiment, right?
In some ways, that's right.
Yeah. So I
Um,
mean, and that goes into like, you've done this, you have a very unique, experience because you've done it a few times.
Yeah.
So let's say if I was, now I'm going off the reservation.
You're getting out of your
Yeah, I
reserve
know.
seating again, aren't you? Okay, here we go.
I know. So if I was the CEO of a company and I talked with Ken, I met him at the, dinner or an event. I said, "Oh, wow, that's interesting. We've been thinking about an innovation center or unit. What are the top, like maybe 3 or 4 questions you would ask me to even to tell you that you should even continue talking to me? If it's,
Right.
like if this is a viable opportunity, or like, okay, maybe 5 years in the future they'll be ready."
Right. The number one question is why?
Okay.
Why do you want to do it, and what do you think you're going to get from it? What do you
Well, because
what
we
do you
think
hope
we
to
need
get?
to be innovative, and we hear from all the analysts and other companies who are innovative, they are, really competitive. And so let's say i'm,
Yeah.
I'm answering you that in those
Right.
terms.
So help me understand what does it mean to be innovative in your business?
Creating new products, increasing our new product launches, and our profitability, happier customers.
Right. Right. So those are lots of different possibilities, and all of them are good. So which one do you think is most important to you in the next 2 to 5 years?
Profitability.
Okay, so you need to drive more profitability. Your innovation, the purpose of your innovation then would be to drive more profitability.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Excellent. So are you doing anything with continuous improvement today?
What's that?
Oh, you don't have a continuous improvement program? Well, let's talk about that. You ever heard
Okay.
of a thing called Six Sigma? And then now we can break in. So I'll break it. This is where we right. So this is common, right? Is that you need to understand what innovation means to you, and what is the outcome you're trying to generate. What's your most important outcome factor before you can decide whether or not you really need a lab, or if you have a lab, what's the purpose of it, right?
Right.
So if what you're mostly concerned about as a CEO then is, hey, I'm trying to make the company more profitable, right? Then okay, there's only two ways. The profitability then is driven by margin. So you need to either increase your price or decrease your costs. There's only two ways of getting there, right?
Right.
One or the other. And so we can figure out, okay, so we want innovative ideas about how we push through a price increase, or we want innovative ideas about how we lower our cost of delivery,
Right.
right? And then once you decide what outcome you're trying to generate, you can put the right people and the right process and the right function around delivering against that particular outcome.
Okay.
And I think that is I think that what you just said and did is exactly one of the major problems with failing innovation labs for companies, is that someone comes in and says, hey, we want to do this because it's a good idea, and it is a good idea. It's a really good idea. We need to go do this, and this is what we're going to do. And you spend money doing it, and you put a team in place, but you don't really know why you did it, or what it was you were trying to generate as an outcome. And the people that you put in place, the process that you put in place, the paradigm that you put in place in terms of how you're going to deliver, whether it's continuous improvement and Six Sigma, or it's design thinking, or it's lean startup, or it's whatever else, right? All these different processes you could do. Which one you pick is based on what you're trying to deliver. And until you know what the outcome is that you're trying to deliver, what flavor of innovation you're trying to deliver to the market through your company, it's impossible to know how to drive that.
Right. So from this conversation, like a test, you probably get a sense of how much work it's going to be to educate me and my probably team, or what, organization, in even getting to the right place to start, as
Hmm.
opposed to if I had asked you, hey Ken, this is something that I've heard that's very, could be very interesting, and we definitely need to become more innovative. um, what are your thoughts about putting together an experiment to create an innovation unit? and setting it up right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, as long as I think that that's a good I think it's a possibility and could be useful as long as you know what the hypothesis is that you're trying to experiment against.
But what
And
I'm
it,
saying is that I want you to help me come up with that.
yeah, I mean, so that would be the series of, again, continuing that series of questions, right?
Right,
Is how do we going to dig into what your purpose is? You know, what's the infinite game you're playing here? What are you trying to get out of it? What are you going to be held accountable to
right,
relative to the results? And then we can devise a plan for how do we put together the right experiment in order to see if you're where you are, right? To
right,
find out. And what you're the purpose of the experiment is to learn something and find evidence. So we're going to need to go figure out what evidence we're looking for. Is it, do you know what has, so if we were to continue that discussion and we were to drive in even deeper, we'd start talking a little bit about what you believe to be true about your organization today, and what things that that you believe that, and how you believe that's either going to benefit or not benefit you going forward in the future. Why do you want to do this? You're talking about changing something. I'm going to
right,
change something. I'm going to create an innovation lab or whatever it is. Okay, so if you're going to do that, why do you think you need to make this change? What is it about your current way of doing things that leads you to believe this is a change you need to make?
okay.
And dig into that more, so you start to uncover what are the underlying beliefs and issues that it's funny, we have this discussion, is that I've been through this before, and asked a lot of these questions, in terms of
That's why I'm
trying to get
asking
to
you.
that,
Yes,
right?
yes.
um, so it is, and sometimes you get the answers, and they end up changing, but that is, part and parcel to you got to know why you want to do it. What is the, because it can't just be, you know, I've seen so many. I've got a good friend who runs an innovation center that, started on the back of, like so many do, on the back of Shark Tank, right?
Okay,
Some CEO really likes Shark Tank, loves Mark Cuban or Mr. Wonderful or whatever it is, or they've
right,
seen, Dragon's Den in Europe or whatever it is, and they're like, we need to do that, right? And they don't really know much more about it other than, let's get ideas, let's offer some money for the best one, and have them pitch them,
mm-hmm.
and we'll spend some money and we'll implement, we'll get the best ideas, and right,
Okay,
and that becomes your purpose, right? Is to deliver a Shark Tank experience.
mm-hmm.
And so I've got a friend who's been down this road and been through that, and he talked about how disastrous that was, and even the things that won are no longer even known about anymore. They kind of disappeared into the ether. But what they were able to do was build a culture of the coolness of submitting ideas and getting feedback. They did a really good job across all of the ideas that were submitted of giving people feedback and building up a better understanding of the problems they were facing
Right,
and why, so they leverage that. This guy, I'm giving him credit. I'm gonna leave him nameless because I don't want to go, but I give him credit for understanding that, hey, I can leverage a bad idea, doing my own corporate Shark Tank, into a good idea by using it as a mechanism to teach people about our causes, our problems, and our long term, and getting them interested that way.
right,
um, so a lot of times you have these discussions and you never know where they're going to go with a CEO. Why do they want to do a certain thing? But you've got to figure that out, so that you can figure out how to drive it, in the most effective way possible.
right, right. No,
I
that's
don't know
that.
why I got on
Yeah,
that particular subject. I mean, but I think that that's kind of one of the, again, I think I said this earlier, is that one of the big failings of turning up an innovation lab is not knowing why you're doing it.
right, right. I think that that's definitely. I mean, that's a perfect use case for this concept of turning projects into experiments. The CEO or whoever spoke saw this Shark Tank idea and thought they immediately turned it into a project. as
Hmm.
if, but if they had turned it into an experiment, they would actually start thinking about what are the success factors before going into that, and becoming a lot more defined about measurement and things like that before they even started doing this. And
Hmm.
you know from what you told me, it wasn't a failure. They actually turned it into some lessons,
Yes.
and it wasn't. But in some people's minds, maybe it wasn't. In the mind of the CFO, maybe it was a failure because he
Right.
couldn't quantify
Yeah.
this
For
work.
the people inside the company who thought this was going to lead to their next billion-dollar idea,
Right,
it felt like a failure
right,
because they had an unrealistic expectation going in of why they were doing it.
right,
Um, but to the people who wanted to leverage it as a learning mechanism, uh, and and who saw it as a vehicle to get information to the employee base,
right.
um, they found it to be a great success.
Yeah, and
Um,
then
now,
yeah,
now they've been able to take all of the things they created in order to deliver the Shark Tank. They took all the stuff they created and now use it for a different purpose. But they've got the infrastructure, and they don't have nearly as many people working on it anymore. But it's much more valuable
right,
because they were able to learn from how they rolled it out and what they and the mechanisms they created for it.
right, right. And that goes to another point about all the innovation labs who get started and then they get shut down.
Hmm.
And did the organization learn the right lessons from that experiment? Because if you shut down the lab, what does that mean? You're not innovative anymore? Are you going to innovate in a different way? Are you going to go back to the ways you used to innovate when you thought it wasn't enough? Um, so this is like a typical thing that a lot of people do, is that they fail, whatever that means, uh, and then they quit instead of saying, you know what, let's look at this 2 or 3 years of experience that we had here and
Right.
design the next lab better. Set our
Right.
expectations based on reality of what we learned about our own culture, our own organization, instead of, but if you quit, you just lost all of that experience and
That's right.
the lessons. That's a much bigger failure, in my opinion.
Agreed. No, I agree with you. That's not atypical
Yeah, right,
in the corporate space. I mean, you start these things with the wrong set of expectation, the wrong area of focus, and without really knowing why you're doing it or the reason you're doing it changes, and you don't recognize it. Um, and then there's some well-known statistics out there. I can't quote them. I don't have my hands on them right here, but of the number of labs that get closed. They started, they close, and then they usually reopen again a year or two later because they realize that there really was something we should have been doing here. We
right,
just didn't realize what it was.
right,
Um, and it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing for companies to do. I mean, it requires a substantial amount of people change, and people are hard to change.
right,
They don't, it's people do not act in their own best interest a lot of times, and there is this notion that we can take experts at what they do today and put them in charge of things, and it's a completely different skill set depending on what you're trying to deliver. So if you don't know that going in, uh, you're going to suffer. You're just going to
right,
suffer.
right. Yeah, learning the lessons, the right lessons. Thank you taking the time to talk to me, Ken. It was pleasure meeting you, and hopefully we'll um, you know get together again and talk some more about our wonderful lessons in the world of innovation and experimentation.
Absolutely. I really have enjoyed it, Darius. Thank you very much.